Google Plus Hangout about the 2015 elections. To all our viewers at home tuning in, if you have any questions you'd like to ask during our discussion, look for the Q&A icon. I think it's yellow, it might be blue, but there should be a little icon floating around somewhere that says Q&A, and you can click that to type in your question. So let's get started today by introducing our panelists. So first off, we have Jonathan Martin, who is an opinion writer here at the Seattle Times. We also have Danny Westneat, who's a Metro columnist, and Jonathan, for one, is on our editorial board and interviewed to the election. Danny did not. He had nothing to do with our endorsements, so he wanted me to make that distinction for you all. Danny works in news. Jonathan works in opinion.
Oops, I'm losing Caitlin.
But Danny has been weighing in on election issues as well, so that's why we're including him here. You might have seen his column this week, which was titled "Seattle's Increasingly Liberal Voters Say Bring It On," so we're going to talk about that today. And finally, we have Sandeep Kaushik. He's a local political consultant who's worked on several initiatives in this election and elections of the past. Why don't you tell everyone the ones that you worked on this time around?
Sure. I did work on Initiative 1401, which is the initiative about the trafficking in animal parts from endangered species. I worked on Let's Move Seattle, the Seattle Transportation Levy, and and I was on the no side of I-122, which is the so-called Honest Elections Initiative. I also did some work on the independent expenditure side for the independent expenditure campaigns we did on behalf of Tim Burgess and Shannon Braddock.
All right, so you've been all over the place, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so to start off with, we thought we'd jump right into this idea of Seattle voters saying yes to everything. Several levies passed, including the massive Move Seattle transportation levy. What do you guys think about that? Any surprises in all those yes votes?
Well, I'll jump in. Yeah, Let's Move Seattle passed. It's passing overwhelmingly. The late counts have us above 60%. We're probably going to end up 57, 58%. I think Let's Move Seattle won, and in this case, the media lost. And by the media, I'm looking at Jonathan and Danny here. I think that there was a pretty negative framing around this initiative and a lot of the media coverage from a lot of different outlets. And turns out it wasn't in tune with where Seattle voters were. There's this whole kind of perennial theme that comes up. The Seattle Times has pushed this for years about levy fatigue without, as far as I can tell, a scintilla of credible evidence that it actually exists. So anyway, I was very pleasantly surprised by the results on that campaign. We got a lot of scrutiny, and some of it fair, but some of it I thought was sort of framed in a way that doesn't really fit where Seattle is and where its voters.
So if there's absolutely no evidence of levy fatigue, why were you so nervous on election night?
Well, I think there is something real going on. And there is a segment of the Seattle voting population, I would describe it as kind of 50 and over, longtime residents, homeowners, who have real anxiety and fear about the pace of change in the city. They feel like the Seattle that they sort of grew up in or have lived in for years is disappearing out from under them. They're not sure what their place is in this kind of new Seattle, this urbanist Seattle, dense Seattle, growing Seattle. They're not a majority, but they have a lot of anxiety and they're very vocal. And my guess is I don't think that there was any kind of bias at the Seattle Times to try to overtly take this down, but I think KUW too did this too. They pushed this levy fatigue stuff. What I think is that folks like that are kind of overrepresented in the editorial leadership of a lot of media outlets around town, and so they're susceptible to those kind of arguments. So there is something real going on, but it's not some kind of broad-based rebellion against the progressive agenda. that we.
Well, I think that part of what we see, I mean, it's there of the moment, but you're also looking at what's going to happen next year. You know, the mayor's talked about this law enforcement levy, the doubling of the housing levy, and then Sound Transit is going to be the mother of all asks for voters. And so, you know, I personally, I'm a fan of light rail, and I really want to see an expansion. And what I get worried about is that you keep having this drip, drip, drip of these one-off levies, and there has been. We ran a chart during the election that showed it wasn't just us making this up. There actually was an increasing reliance on these one-off levies, and I understand because of Hyman and all that. But it's a real thing, and whether it's not real, whether it's real now, I think that's going to be a real question within a year.
So my issue, Sandeep, about levy fatigue. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my computer is running really slow, so it's very herky-jerky. My issue wasn't that I feel overtaxed; it's that I feel underserved. Mm-hmm. And a number of the past levies, the fire station levy is $100 million over budget and years behind schedule. The previous Bridging the Gap levy, didn't bridge the gap, and then later SDOT had to admit that it was never actually intended to bridge the gap. It was basically sold on a kind of a false premise. And and then you have the streetcars have been kind of a debacle. You have the seawall is $100 million over budget and now behind schedule. And so my issue is I've never felt like I pay too much in taxes, but I don't feel that I'm necessarily being all that well served for it. Now I do, even given all that, I still thought that Let's Move would pass because levies always pass in Seattle. I was joking to you the other day that you have the easiest job in American politics, which is advocating for a Seattle property tax levy. So you probably start with, we had this funny moment in the campaign where a guy running for council, Sandy Brown, was asked if he was going to vote for your levy, Let's Move, and he said, yeah, I'm from Seattle, so I always vote for the tax levy. And then he proceeded to talk about all the ways that it was going to fail North Seattle and so forth, but he was voting for it anyway. And so I think you start with a city that has a culture of wanting to help. I mean, the hard part with voting no is we all see the crying need for transportation improvements. It is very difficult to vote no because then you feel like you're just a naysayer who isn't willing to actually come together for the community good. And so I think you start with a huge, overwhelming, positive vibe about these levies. It would be very difficult to fail one, which is why I thought it was going to pass, but I thought if it failed, it was going to be a major problem for the mayor. And to his credit, it didn't, and he has yet another success. The guy's really running the table on these things. You have to give him credit for it.
And Danny's point is exactly why our editorial board didn't endorse it, is that we felt like, well, at least partly, that there was a lack of accountability on how the money is spent. It's not like we don't want, a better transportation system, but you also just don't want to, just blow money down what may be a hole.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm rolling my eyes a little bit. Like, in terms of accountability, that this levy actually did have more accountability measures built into it than previous levies. What's part of what bugged me and irritated me about the media coverage for over the last month and a half. And if you'd lived through it, Danny, you wouldn't think it was like that I had the easiest job in the world because we were taking incoming from all over the place. But there's things like, oh my God, that there's flexibility in the project list, that the project list could change. My God, this is some new phenomenon, when in fact, actually there's less flexibility in this levy package than there was in, say, Bridging the Gap or previous levies. This is not something new and different, though, that wasn't contextualized by the media. Or the stuff about, oh my God, even the League of Women Voters came out against this levy, when in fact the League of Women Voters in recent years have come out against almost every levy. They came out against the pre-K levy. They came out against the parks levy. They came out against the county's metro levy last year. And so this idea that this gets trotted out as some kind of radical shift oh my God, what's going on in Seattle? The League of Women Voters came out against this levy. It just doesn't hold water. Like, it's sort of a tendentious effort to buttress the skepticism and opposition that some folks have to the levy. To Danny's point that there were issues about bridging the gap, and in some areas, I think that's a fair point. The issue about 360 lane miles, that was a promise during the campaign, and that SDOT ended up at about 310 lane miles, 310 lane miles. That's fair. And that some of the goals changed without the public being informed about it. I think that's a fair criticism of what's happened. That happened under previous administrations some years ago, but it was a perfectly valid thing, I think, to point out, an accurate thing. My issue was with this kind of, this thing is going down, people are, oh my God, there's unprecedented opposition, and
But Sandeep, you were partly saying that yourself. So
yeah, you said that yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
The mayor staff was saying that.
I admit we were nervous going into election night. We did have some late polling I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. I thought it was going to be I thought we would be down on election night, maybe down as low as 46%, but that the late ballots of younger voters would break strongly in our favor. What we saw in our polling was that there was a really sharp generational divide. Older voters were opposing and younger voters were supporting, and in an off-year, low turnout election, when there's a lot of money being spent against you, I was nervous. I didn't know whether those late votes would sort of pull us over or not.
Let me jump in. Can I jump in on that?
Go ahead, David.
Let me jump in on that to move this forward instead of talking about why some people thought it was going to fail, because it did pass, and it passed overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm. To me, the even bigger news coming out of that than that there is no tax fatigue is that the levy was sold really as a green urbanism policy, that Seattle's going to get denser, it's growing rapidly, that we don't have any more room for cars, and that we're going to shrink some of the car lanes to put in transit-only lanes, that we're going to do more road diets, we're going to have more bike paths, more alternative means for getting around. All of these things are really controversial. And I think the city just endorsed all that stuff, the city's voters, which is the people that matters. And so, to me, I mean, I always thought that there wasn't that much tax fatigue, but I did think that people stuck in traffic in cars, I mean, most of the city still drives a car to get around. And there's so much grumbling about the traffic, and what the voters just endorsed was sort of the environmentalist green method of attacking that problem. And I thought that's a huge story going ahead.
I think that's absolutely right. Look, you describe all of those things as controversial. I suppose they're controversial. They're also all really popular. When you ask Seattle voters, do they want more bike lanes? They're like, absolutely we do. Do they want more transit? Transit is incredibly popular. It's much more popular than road paving and car paving, and we've seen that in the sound transit votes and stuff like that. So yeah, there is a progressive transportation vision that this levy embodied, and we were open about that because we thought that that's what Seattle voters wanted. There was a pretty extensive public input process in putting this levy together. And the feedback that not just the mayor's office, but the council and the various SDOT, the various drafts of the proposal went through, was refined along those lines, because that's the input that the city was getting.
All right, let's move on, because we could obviously talk about transportation and move Seattle for hours. But moving on to the city council, quite a few new faces. I think we have 4 new people stepping into office. Majority women, first Latina ever elected to the council. What are your thoughts on just the changes? Is this going to be a new future in the way things are done in City Hall, or?
Well, one of the things I was curious about was how long Kshama Sawant's coattails are. You had, people were talking about sort of the slate of sort of Sawant-aligned candidates, and with Licata leading the council, if she was going to have a fairly loyal vote with just Mike O'Brien, or a like-minded vote with just Mike O'Brien, be more. And it's interesting that Shama Sawant's coattails don't look very long. You know, with Jess Spear running against Frank Chop a couple of years ago and really getting trounced, and the candidates that kept appearing with her at her sort of core platform news conferences didn't do well. In particular, the Tim Burgess, John Grant race was, I think, a real litmus test of that sort of coattail effect. And Burgess, of course, helped by a lot of money, really did incredibly well. So that's, I think, if I think depending on what happens with Herbold and Braddock, I don't think Herbold would in any way be really a Sawant loyalist either. But it'd be interesting to see how the council goes forward.
So I'll just jump in. I think this was much more of a continuity election than it was a change election. Yes, new system, districts, neighborhoods, all of that, and that did have some impacts on how people campaigned and talked to voters, though not as much impact maybe as people expected going into it. But in the end, we have seen in the last few election cycles in Seattle that there is a single fundamental fault line in Seattle politics, and it's really a fault line. I hate this the way the media sometimes uses the shorthand of calling some members progressive, council members progressive, others conservatives, because I think that's silly. Like it's really a fault line within Seattle progressivism. And on the one hand, you have what I would call there's the only kinds of candidates who can win. We saw that in the primary. Like you can either run as a kind of noisy populist, which is sort of, I'm going to plant the flag and compromise is a dirty word, and I'm going to demonize anybody who doesn't agree with me, and it's about the purity of our convictions and standing for that. I think Councilmember Sawant represents that. I think Mike McGinn, the former mayor, kind of represented that view. And there's another view of Seattle progressivism, which is kind of this communitarian progressivism. It's about, hey, let's work together, let's bring everybody to the table, let's figure it out, let's get to, if we have to do this incrementally or compromise, that's fine. It's about getting things done, right? Not about sort of trumpeting your virtue through your politics. And that's really the divide. In the primary, we saw candidates on both sides of that divide do well, but anybody else who tried to run on some different axis, the neighborhoodies, Roderick, who ran the kind of arts campaign, they all fell by the wayside. And that divide continues. Yes, in this election, the more kind of communitarian progressive types appear to be winning and maybe even running the table.
And this was a low turnout election. I wonder if those folks ran next year with a wave of a presidential year, if you'd get more of those, the real rabble-rousing populists in an election that draws out more young people. They would do significantly better. Absolutely. In an 80% turnout election.
Yeah, I don't agree.
Yeah,
I agree with you guys. I don't agree with you that Sawant didn't have any coattails, because just look at the Burgess-Grant race. Now Grant is not going to win, but look what Tim Burgess did. I mean, normally in an election you try to draw distinctions with your opponent. You try to say how you're different than your opponent. And Tim Burgess, who's been on the council for years, he spent the whole time trying to blur the differences between him and his opponent. I mean, this is a guy who came around in the last month of the election and sponsored a rent control resolution. Previously he'd voted for the $15 minimum wage. He came out with a major gun control proposal to put a tax on gun shops. This is supposedly the moderate in the race. I mean, that he made himself as far left liberal, at least in appearance, as he possibly could. And to me, a lot of that's being driven by Sawant's sort of activism, but it's really being driven by how liberal the Seattle electorate has gotten. That now, even in the press coverage in like The Stranger and so forth, they're calling, Bruce Harrell the moderate. And I'm like, Bruce Harrell is nobody's definition of a moderate. And so the whole political spectrum in Seattle, which has always been, on the left side, has shifted way, way, way over to the left. Everyone is over essentially in Sawant's territory now.
But I mean, Sawant's territory. If you look at what her core issues are, the socialist issues, she's talking about pretty much about the millionaire's tax. She's talking about, in her originally she ran talking about the $15 minimum wage, a millionaire's tax, and rent control. And I mean, the thing that Burgess got through, that I grant you, is he totally was trying to give himself cover from the Grant crowd, but it was like this real super like watered down version of a rent control ordinance, and this was just a request to the legislature to think about it. So I mean, I don't think that she has moved the agenda, certainly on the $15 minimum wage. She had a big role there, but in terms of what she's actually legislating, when you look at what she ran on, she said, she ran on Indigenous Peoples Day, and the Seattle Housing Authority rent increases that Murray also came out against. I think she's moved the tactic and the style and the rhetoric, but in terms of what she's actually legislating, the legislature is not going to pass rent control. No. The legislature is not going to pass a millionaire's tax.
So, no, everybody knows that. You're completely right. Sorry, I'll be quick, Sandeep.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say I had a city council member say to me that Sawant isn't pulling the council to the left so much as the voters of the city are pushing the council to the left. They're pushing the entire body over towards Sawant. And so, and I think you can see it just in the way that the supposed mainstream moderate candidates are behaving. They're all passing policies, and I agree with you, Jonathan, that rent control resolution is relatively empty, but they still got an 8-to-1 vote on the Seattle City Council for rent control, and a resolution saying, hey, let's explore this further. And so I just feel like the whole conversation has moved substantially to the left.
I don't think that's new, right? I think I've been hearing all this stuff that you guys put out saying, oh my God, there's a sharp turn to the left in this election. I was like, where have you guys been for the last few years? like Seattle went left a long time ago. And I got an interview with Dave Croman from Crosscut last week about the influence and impact of the stranger endorsements in citywide races. The stranger has significant impact. Now, they may be more left of the electorate. I mean, when I look at this election and you see, I'm with Jonathan that the candidates that really tried to lash themselves to Sawant weren't successful. And by
the way, lash themselves to the stranger as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the angry white guy who sees the role of council member being to burn down City Hall, follow Sawant with the pitchforks and the torches to burn down City Hall. That is a kind of candidate. The stranger loves that kind of candidate. John Grant, Michael Maddox. But guess what? Seattle voters aren't as enthusiastic about that kind of candidate.
Yeah, but these candidates you're talking about got 45% of the vote.
Yeah.
You look at what's happening to Bruce Harrell. He's within, his challenger is within 8 points of him, and he's a longtime incumbent. And so that's very unusual in this city. You don't have incumbents losing. The only one that's lost that I can think of other than some mayors has been Richard Conlon when he lost to Sawant. And so you have extremely liberal members.
And Gene Godden.
Yes, well, I agree. As I said, it's that fundamental divide, that this populist left kind of style in Seattle politics is you can win that way. I mean, in this election, the folks who ran that way didn't. But you're right, they did well. They did well in the primary. They came close in a lot of these races. It's still possible that Lisa Herbold, who's a little bit more complicated, but kind of is more on that side of the divide, could end up winning the race in West Seattle. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's still a possibility. So that thing is real, right? I mean, yes, and there are a lot of Seattle voters that like that style of politics, and frankly, like the thing I don't like that style of politics is I don't think it's about getting things done, right? I don't think it's very it's sort of posturing and grandstanding and that kind of stuff, and I'd rather how do you get from A to B to C.
One of the questions I had for this council is that this issue about developer impact fees came up, and it was interesting to see the way that it was sort of embraced what I saw sort of across the continuum, where you had council members that are supposedly in the pocket of developers are now suddenly talking about impact fees. And I'm not sure if that is, and that's an issue that I think unites both the sort of a more sort of quote conservative, sort of the neighborhood first act folks like Catherine Wheatbrook, who ran against Mike O'Brien, as well as you had Braddock talking about this as well. Mm-hmm. I'll be curious what they do going forward, because this is going to be the real test of power in Seattle is development. I mean, the Seattle City Council is pretty much a land use planning board, and I'll be curious what's sort of the test of. What do you guys think? Do you think the developer impact fees are actually going to get imposed?
I think a lot of this stuff is on the table.
No.
Why not?
Danny, weigh in. All right.
Because I think has developed a really powerful alliance between developers, environmentalists, and social justice groups about getting up zones and higher density in the city, and all three of these groups, well, particularly the environmentalists and developers, are opposed to developer impact fees on the principle that they would just raise the cost of housing. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of convincing the social justice groups that it's counterproductive to impose them. And so I think, especially based on the results of the election, where all the urbanist endorsed candidates are winning, I think developer impact fees are going to have a hard road.
Look, 2016, the story of 2016 on issues of housing affordability are going to be tied to the HALA recommendations. There's another big win for the mayor, that he got developers in a room with, as Danny says, the housing advocates and the low income and social justice advocates, and they hammered out what I would call a historic deal, this grand bargain, where for the first time, if this stuff passes, for the first time in Seattle's history, developers are going to be mandated to pay towards affordable housing on essentially every project that they do. And so I think that still needs to pass. And I think there is, among this, as we talked about earlier, this older set of voters that sort of oppose the levies and are worried about change. Those are the kind of people that fueled the Danny Westneat-led backlash on the single-family zoning thing. I think those people are going to be resistant on some of the HALA changes. You're shaking your head. You know about that.
It wasn't led by me. I just released the report. And by the way,
you say that because you know it's not true.
the grand bargain is not that historic. They already do it in Federal Way, in Redmond, in Kirkland. Yeah. They've been doing inclusionary mandatory housing for years.
Yeah, guess what? The single family changes to allow the exact same zoning that Portland uses in their residential neighborhood. And last time I checked, Portland was a pretty nice place. So it wasn't that radical.
Sandeep, it wasn't just the zoning changes, the way they were explained too. There was, what Danny's right. All he did is throw this out there and say, this looks kind of, what the hell is going on here? And the city responded. The mayor backed away like he had skates on, because there is a real constituency for this, and there's a reason why the zoning has not been messed with, and Urban has been talking about it for a long time and all that. The mayor wants to get reelected.
Yeah, no, I admit there is that constituency. I just think it's overrepresented in places like the Seattle Times and our media, and that's why that people tend to sort of see issues through their personal frame and worldview. And I think that I'm going back to Let's Move Seattle. I feel like the coverage of that measure got framed through that prism, which happens to not actually be where most Seattle voters are and how they think about stuff. But hey, we won, so I'm sort of being graceless here about both of you guys. So I'm very happy. Whatever your feeble and ineffectual efforts to attack us sort of fell by the wayside, and truth and justice triumphed. So.
Okay, so let's move on. And Actually this kind of dovetails in terms of a changing Seattle into one of the reader questions that we got, which was from John in Falls City. And his question was kind of bringing up this same, familiar question we've heard time and time again of, is Seattle losing its soul? He says, Seattle's a relatively young city. This voting electorate is young and educated, many coming from industries that remake themselves constantly. I suppose that's a jab at our friends at Amazon and similar tech industries. He says Seattle is quickly just treat Seattle's past on to ask about historic preservation. Will it be relegated to mere facadism? So we kind of talked about development and all of that, housing affordability, but I don't know if there's anything else to add to answer John's question specifically.
We lost a little bit of the question of killing a bad connection. The facade.
Asking about development, is Seattle losing its soul? Will this council treat any of those concerns differently?
I mean, there's certainly the pace of change right now is pretty extraordinary. The development, but Seattle's a port town. I mean, it has been a city of transience since it began. There's been periods of relative stability, but I think Seattle's sort of remarkable for the fact that it does have an indigenous culture here, but it's not like Philadelphia. It's not like Boston. Things have always been done the same way forever. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
Look, I think Seattle is changing really fast. I'm okay with change. I think cities need to change if they're going to thrive and grow and do well. I mean, I moved here from Cleveland in 2002, and everybody was sort of moping around, going like, "Oh my God, the dot-com bust is over, and Seattle's in a recession." And I'm like, "What the hell are these people talking about? Like, this place is booming compared to Cleveland. Like, no one hasn't built anything in Cleveland in 20 years. Like, this is insane. You people don't know how good you have it here." And so Seattle does have problems, but they're the problems of success, right? Which are much better problems to have than the problems of failure. And it is, yes, we're growing, and we're growing fast, and that creates challenges. That creates transportation challenges. We need a bigger levy to deal with our transportation challenges. And guess what? That's what we just passed. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I do think that there's a kind of there's this sort of old Seattle contingent of folks that this kind of change does worry them, and they do wonder whether the kind of old Boeing Jet City kind of Seattle of sort of middle class bungalows is disappearing out from under them. And I think they have a legitimate right to be concerned, because I think some of the negatives about the change that they're focusing on are real. But I don't know that there's any force, government, the media, the business community, that's actually going to. These are larger social forces that are at play in Seattle's sort of growth and development. I don't know whether any of us can really make that much. We can try to continue to make the city livable and maintain our quality of life, but I don't think we can stop growth or stop change.
Yeah, and I think what I sensed that the questioner was asking about was this idea of facadism. Like here in South Lake Union, they take the old brick building and they say just the facade, and then they put a 40-story glass tower inside the 2-story brick facade. And it sounded to me like the questioner was saying this is like a metaphor for the whole city. And is there a way, and I think that there is, to retain some of the things that we love about Seattle at the same time that we grow? I mean, it's just obvious we're going to have to densify. And the mayor and the HALA committee is 100% correct that we're in desperate need of a major supply of new housing. But when you build that housing, there are legitimate questions to be asked about where you build it, how fast you build it, and to me, one of the most important things, what does it look like when it's done? And right. You can, look at the great cities of the world that are way denser than Seattle, like Amsterdam or Paris, and they manage to do density in a smaller scale. It doesn't have to be in 40-story glass towers. And so I think that those are the questions that we can both grow and densify and change, like Sandeep was talking about, but also preserve some of the city's character.
You know, one of the pieces of the character that the Seattle Times Ed Board has gotten a little bit of grief for talking about the port all the time, but that's really, I mean, you talk about a character of the city and trying to preserve the maritime and industrial corridor, which is, you know, frankly, it is at risk, it is in danger, because that's a lot of nice land that could be those nice shiny 40-story towers, Danny. So that if you're going to hang on to the character, one of the things you got to do is you got to realize sort of the core of it is, and that, you know, the fishing fleet in Ballard feels to me like as much sort of an essential element of Seattle as any piece. You know, and in terms of the facadism and what development looks like, and that's the thing I've heard more than anything else is like, okay, we're gonna upzone the crap out of all these urban villages, and what's it gonna look like? And you know, the mayor has talked about sort of design review standards and stuff, and re-looking at them. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but if you want to really sort of start really ticking off the neighborhoods, they're going to start being upzoned and having a lot of density thrown into them. You know, have those stretches of Ballard just sort of put onto a postcard and sent around the city, and you're going to have that's the kind of thing that gets people really stirred up.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you. That I do think I don't know what the answer is either, but I do think there is way too much kind of generic cookie cutter kind of development. I think some of that happens not in spite of, but because of the design review process. I think everything goes into this blender and sort of comes out the other end all looking kind of the same and not very, very distinctive or compelling. But I'm not an expert on that. But I think there's a fear out there, and this is wider than that older core folks, that we're going to end up some kind of cut rate San Francisco. You know, basically a high income, high taxes, high services city. And where, you know, the middle class is kind of hollowed out, and it's just a place where either very poor people or very rich people live, and I do think that's a widespread concern in the city, and that's something that you know, that goes to sort of Seattle trying to maintain its own unique identity and character, and not just sort of become like, you know, the bigger folks down the road, right? But that's a big challenge for city government. It's a big challenge for the civic community for the next, you know, couple of decades. Is how do we grow and not lose our, you know, distinctiveness or funkiness or whatever you want to call it.
Hey, can I say another thing about how left-wing this election was? Is that we glommed on to this $100 democracy voucher thing that completely changes the way local elections are run, even though it seems to me like local elections are run pretty well. I mean, we do have some problems with independent expenditure groups trying to blackmail candidates, but other than that little hiccup, no, I've kind of figured that honest elections thing would pass, but I was kind of surprised by the margin and sort of the lack of questioning of it, and maybe it will work out splendidly, but it strikes me as the kind of sort of, hey, this appeals to all of our ideas about everything that's wrong with Citizens United. Let's try to remake our elections, you know, in the image of, you know, giving power back to the people, and it all has these good motivations, but in the details it seems to me like it's really open to abuse. It's really going to favor probably unions and various associations that can direct the vouchers in certain directions. It might end up really favoring incumbents, things like that. So I was kind of surprised there wasn't more critiquing of it going on.
Well, and you know, the thing, I think it's actually not going to change elections that much, because I think that you still have the massive problem of Citizens United. You know, these independent expenditure groups that came in the city council races, I think spent 5 times the previous peak. I might be a little bit off there, but it was like $800 grand in independent expenditures. And when you have this sort of Rube Goldberg machine of these democracy vouchers and pretty strict limits, I just see that the money just flowing into independent expenditures, and folks like Sandeep are gonna make a killing off this. I mean, it's if you want real campaign finance reform, the way to do it is not to like slap together these kind of reform efforts. It's just to keep the pressure on Congress and the Supreme Court to go back on Citizens United. That's been a disaster.
So there was a relatively sort of token opposition campaign that I organized, and I didn't get paid for it. I took it on because I didn't like this measure at all. I mean, I do think it's well-intentioned, but Danny, I'm glad you brought this up, because the point you made, I know you wrote this the other day, that this is again another sign of our turn to the left in Seattle voters, bold embrace of these bold, experimental, progressive things, and I think that's BS in this case, right? I think guess what? I used this line with Eli yesterday at the Stranger. Guess what? Like, I could take a Xerox of my ass and in crayon write campaign finance reform plan on the top of it, and if you gave me $1.4 million, I could pass that in the city of Seattle too. So I think the real lesson of that campaign is that, if you flood the zone and you outspend your opposition 30-1 and you move hundreds of thousands of dollars, you can get people, and you have a sort of seemingly nice progressive sounding, initiative that's a little complicated and there isn't a whole lot of media coverage about it. And you can flood the zone and win that election. But I will tell you, from people close to the other side, told me 2 weeks ago they were under 50. Organically, Seattle voters were not particularly enthusiastic about these ideas and have some of the same concerns that Danny expressed, just sort of organically. But guess what? And that's why they didn't spend $1.4 million to get their jollies. They spent it because they felt like they needed to pass this thing. So the lesson of that is they want to run the statewide in 2016. I don't think the fact that they had to spend this much in Seattle to run up the score is a very positive sign for them. Obviously, I'm on the no side of this thing. I don't think it's going to work out well in practice, but
So you're saying that the people of Seattle are not so much liberal as dupes.
Well, I'm saying that campaigning and paid media and all of that stuff works in campaigns, which is that's a sort of a stop the presses. That's not a stop the presses. It's a dog bites man kind of thing. But I mean, $1.4 million on TV, on all the mail, online, and guess what? There wasn't a whole lot of media coverage about this thing. There was a little bit here and there. Times came out against it. There was one story, in that vacuum, if there's essentially a vacuum of other places to get information, then yeah, you can flood the zone and spend a bunch of money. Yeah, you can pass stuff.
I guess we didn't have a narrow worldview on that one, huh? I mean,
sometimes. Look, I mean, this was a big.
We were right on. We were right on Move Seattle as well.
Went for candidates that essentially failed in this election. I think that the Times went hard after Let's Move Seattle, and didn't really. Hit us, but it didn't really in the end, do a whole lot of damage.
That's the whole point of an editorial board, is to talk about accountability and say the stuff that the campaigns don't want to say. I mean, this didn't have anything to do with our opposition to Move Seattle. And I'll let you get away with this earlier. Our position to Move Seattle is not some kind of narrow worldview because we're all bunkered into our bungalows in Ballard. I mean. It was not a well put together piece of a levy, and the fact that you guys had to go after Faye Garneau at the end of the election too was kind of telling to me. Initiative going negative was I don't know, pretty unusual.
We fought hard to pass this levy, and we were in a media environment where we were getting the crap kicked out of us. Almost all of the coverage was framed in this kind of negative way that, oh my God, there's no accountability, which is just not, it wasn't true, and it's no different from previous levies, but the media side, I think you guys not you, the top, but everybody in the media smelled blood, thought this thing was going down, and they wanted a scalp to hang on their wall, like, you know. So in part, and then in part it was sort of just, like I said before, I think it gets, you know, the people who are running the media around here think about stuff.
Okay. How about we move on? Let's get to Olympia before we run out of time. So we got, you guys hear me? Am I cutting out? You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. In the 30th District, in the House, we have Terry Hickle, Republican, leading over the incumbent Carol Gregory, based on early returns. Could signify a shift of power in the House. How's that going to shake things up?
You know, this is the race that nobody really paid attention to in Seattle, and I think it's going to have it's an incremental change in one part of the legislature. But you look back at the last 8-10 years, and Frank Chop used to have a near supermajority in the House, which meant that you could pretty much get a budget through that began at least with a starting point for negotiations with the Senate that was very left. You know, he's pretty much going to be operating with a coalition government now, a coalition House. This is a big deal because when the next budget is going to be written, and the next budget is very important, you're not going to have the starting point of what's going to be, you know, over here to the left. You're going to have a more of a centrist budget, or it's not going to get off the floor. So I find it interesting in a deep blue state. We go blue on just about every issue. The Democrats can keep the governor's mansion, but really have not been able to have lost steadily in the legislature.
And then the Iman initiative is going to pass, and so that makes the fact that Frank Chop really doesn't have much of a majority in the House, and the Republicans already have the Senate. I kind of think that Iman initiative is going to be thrown out in the courts, or at least be challenged in the courts. But the fact that anytime the voters say, I mean, even if they get that initiative thrown out, the fact that the voters voted for it is a big deal in Olympia. We've seen time and again where Iman passes initiatives, they get thrown out in the courts, and then the legislature says, well, you know what, the people wanted this, so we're gonna follow the spirit of it anyway. And so I thought that this election was fascinating because of what was going on inside Seattle. It's hardly news that Seattle is a liberal island compared to the rest of the state, but it seems to me that the distinctions are only growing. I mean, Spokane rejected a kind of a minimum wage proposal. It's very unusual for voters to vote down a wage when it's on the ballot.
And Tacoma went with a $12 instead of $15.
They decided to only go for $12, which is fine, but the amount of separation now between what's going on in Seattle and the rest of the state, and I think it really complicates politics around here, particularly with the Supreme Court McCleary thing being hung over the legislature. So I don't know where we're headed. I mean, the 2016 elections are now much bigger than it seemed like they might be before.
I kind of feel like Seattle voters are getting sort of a false expectation too when our mayor or the council says, well, we need to get this out of Olympia. You know, we need to go to Olympia and get this. You know, and that was Murray just did it this week with homeless funding. And I mean, great intentions, yeah, absolutely. I think that the federal and state government have backed away from homeless funding, but the expectation for voters is you're going to be able to go to Olympia and get this. And the reality is that it's a totally different world just 60 miles away.
It is, but hey, we got a transportation package through finally last year. We got Sound Transit 3 authorization. So you know, it's not easy, but it's still possible to get stuff done. Though I mostly agree with you guys on this. I actually think that race, the Gregory race, may turn out to be perhaps the most consequential race of this election cycle. You know, we do have now Republican control of the Senate, and it's a 50-48 split now in the House. When you've got conservative Democrats, we could see a kind of roadkill sort of thing emerge. So it does really change the political complexion of how we govern the state. And I haven't done a lot of state stuff recently, but I will tell you, like, you guys are right, over the last any number of election cycles, we have seen a significant erosion of Democratic seats in the suburbs. And I actually think that there may be a kind of messaging issue among my friends, my progressive friends who sort of run campaigns on the state side. When I looked at the messaging around the Gregory race, or around that race, what I saw was a lot of messaging that was, and ads and stuff like that, that were kind of geared to sort of Seattle liberal, like, paid sick leave and minimum, $15 minimum wage and blah, 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 blah. And then an overlay, a kind of ham-handed and I think misguided overlay of, then let's do some, like they hit Hickel for wanting to raise taxes because she supported the gas tax, which was a major gubernatorial and Democratic priority. And I
thought that was really disingenuous.
I think they need to do I respectfully suggest to my friends they need to do a rethink about how they message in the suburbs. I don't know that they've got it right, and because it's not working.
And one of the things that is working is the Republicans running pro-choice, socially left candidates. Terry Hickel was sort of not like quietly pro-choice. She was just like, yes, very straightforward. That was the right to choose, and I think that makes an enormous difference in a state that's if anything is deep blue about the state, it's social issues.
Absolutely. I look at somebody like Steve Litzow over in Mercer Island. The district he represents is a straight-up Democratic district, but because he's been genuinely a moderate on social issues, though you'll talk to the Nairals and folks like that who have some concerns that he's not 100% on board, but he came out. He came out early for gay marriage, there is potentially a turn in the Republican Party. I don't really see it yet, but there's little glimmers here and there that we may see them break away from some of the national parties.
Well, the flag bearer for the GOP in the governor's race looks to me like Bill Bryant, and Bill's pro-choice, pro-life. Pro-choice and pro-gay marriage. He's taken those right off the table. So it'll be interesting.
I wouldn't be surprised if we got a kind of Clint Didier or some kind of Ellen Craswell type to come into that race and wipe the floor with him.
Yeah.
I'm not.
The standard bearer. He's the standard bearer because they couldn't find anybody else.
Yeah. Everybody else passed because guess what? When it comes to the governor's race and those statewide offices, the Republican Party has a big problem. Rob McKenna was a good candidate in a lot of ways, and he's a guy that understood the fundamental politics of Washington State and spent years he's basically a conservative guy who spent years trying to moderate his image on stuff and nuancing his position on abortion and stuff like that. And then guess what? Gay marriage came along, and in the spring he came out on the wrong side of that. I actually still think if he had been on the, if he'd come out and said, I'm okay with gay marriage, it would have been so much harder for us on the Democratic side to, do the kind of standard, he's just another Republican who doesn't share your worldview, and the stuff that we do in those sorts of campaigns. So anyway, Bill Bryant's not going. I'm not seeing Bill Bryant. I'm not seeing Chris Vance beating Patty Murray. I'm not seeing Bill Bryant beating Joe.
Right. So my connection keeps fading out before I get booted completely. Let's try and wrap up. If you had to sum it up, the election in one word, only one word, no elaboration here, one word each. You guys think you can do this? Sandeep, can we start with you?
Continuity.
All right. Jonathan?
One word?
I'll come back to you. or a phrase, just not like several sentences.
Left wing.
That's 2 words.
Taxes!
All right, there we have it. Okay, thank you everyone for watching. Thanks to our panelists for participating. See you next time.
It's fun. Thanks.